It has only been a few days since Christmas, and yet already we find ourselves 40 days after Christmas in the temple. One of the things that I do when I teach Luke's gospel is I point out how Luke begins in the temple in the holy place with Zechariah and Elizabeth, and how at the very end of his gospel, in the last verse, the disciples return to the temple, continually praising God with great joy. So Luke begins his gospel in the temple, and he ends his gospel in the temple. It's also true of the infancy narrative. We just said that he begins in the temple with Zechariah and Elizabeth, and now the last two passages, both of which we celebrate in this Series B, in the Markan series, the last two passages in the infancy narrative are in the temple. Jesus at 40 days old for the presentation and the purification of Mary, and then in the next passage, which will be the gospel for Easter, Christmas too, is Jesus in the temple at 12 years old. So we end in the temple, and we're in the temple. Some of you might remember from before that I made a note of the fact that from the conception of John the Baptist until Jesus' presentation in the temple, 40 days after his birth, that if you do the math there, you have a total of 490 days. So this is a climactic moment now for Jesus at 40 days old to come to his temple. One of the things that is so important about this passage, just like many of the passages in the infancy narrative, is that many of the great themes of the gospel are being announced here. And those are some of the things I'd like to look at with you in preparation for preaching on this passage. Now, very briefly to start, let's look at the outline of this passage. The first part here, verses 22 to 24, really are an introduction. So we see that here we have Luke sort of orienting us towards the time, the days of the cleansing. And what I would really like to point out here is the fact that what we have here is this reference here to the law of Moses in the law of the Lord in the law of the Lord. What you have here is Mary and Joseph doing what it is that they must do as faithful members of Israel to fulfill the Torah in connection with their child Jesus in coming to the temple 40 days after his birth. And the accent on the keeping of the law, and even the type of sacrifice that they must do here, that is really a citation from the Old Testament. Here's the language of sacrifice, to give the sacrifice. That is the first part of the text. And I wouldn't spend a great deal of time on this, but it might influence in the way in which you think about the text. The next part of the text that I think is so significant, and in many ways it's where all the themes are, is the experience that Mary and Joseph have in the temple with Simeon. And that would be from, of course, verses 25 to 35. You have them here listed. So if the first part is 22 to 24, the second part here now is 25 to 35. And this is in many ways where I think most of your preaching will take place. Now, I've highlighted a couple of things here so that you can sort of see what it is that is of significance. One of the things that is always important to me is in Luke's gospel is this language of kayadu and behold. It usually marks a significant place in the gospel. I talk about it with my students as a nota bene. It's like where you would put an asterisk, note this passage well. And you have not a kayadu, but a do, behold here, in what I think down here at the end of 35 is the most significant part of this text. I don't want to downplay the significance here of the the Nunc Dimittis, but it's something we probably preach on more than we do the statement of Simeon to Mary about Jesus. I've put in yellow here things that I think are some of the great theological themes. The fact that there's a reference here to the Christ, this word peace that comes out of the Nunc Dimittis. Peace is a Lucan theme. It is what, if you remember, perhaps Dr. Scare talked about this in the Gloria in Excelsis with the angels. It's what's said about what Jesus is bringing. In the incarnation, he brings peace on earth. I would also like to point out that in what is almost the equivalent to the Sanctus in Luke 19, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, there is that citation from Psalm 118, but Luke adds that there is going to be peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And so you have this beautiful, I'd call it a frame, an inclusio, almost, at the beginning, at the incarnation, and then at the atonement, of how Jesus joins together heaven and earth in peace. So heaven and earth are joined together in peace, which is really a very important, I think, concept here in all of the gospel. And when I teach the liturgy, I always try to suggest to the students that peace is the number one word in the liturgy. I mean, just follow the liturgy and you'll see that peace is a very significant theme. One other thing about peace in Luke is one of the things that the disciples do when they go from house to house is they greet the house, and they're not supposed to give the greeting that is normally given, and that would probably be Kyrie, rejoice, or even perhaps shalom. Well, Jesus, when he rises from the dead and comes to a house, this is both houses. This is in Luke 9 and Luke 10, and then of course Jesus, after the resurrection, coming to a house in Luke 24. The first thing Jesus says is peace to this house. So there, the greeting of the kingdom, the new greeting, is the greeting of peace. So having peace here, as really one of the major themes of the Nunc Dimittis is significant. There's also the language of salvation. There's the very significant theme of eyes here, and light, of course. Light and eyes are connected, seeing the revelation to the Gentiles. Eyes are very important in Luke's gospel, and here's really one of the first places we see it. If you wanted to draw a theme here, I think the climax of Luke's gospel is in chapter 24, verse 31, where the eyes of the Emmaus disciples are opened in the breaking of the bread. Eyes, there's a physical dimension to eyes, but there's also a spiritual dimension. And here you can see that, they could not recognize Jesus until the breaking of the bread. And I think that if you read the Emmaus story, it's through the teaching on the road, word, and then the breaking of the bread, sacrament, in which, you see how, for the first time, this is why it's the climax, the first time in Luke's gospel you have somebody who recognized Jesus as the crucified and risen Christ. It's also not insignificant that in Luke 19, the last miracle of Jesus, might be 18, I'm having a blank here, but Luke, it's at the end of the journey to Jerusalem. The last miracle in Luke is the opening of the eyes of the blind man there, just before he goes up into Jerusalem in 1928. So, I mean, all these things are just lovely themes that come out of the Nunc Dimittis. And I haven't even talked about, the Gentile mission and the reference to Israel. There you have the two missions of Acts. I mean, we could go on and on and on. I also have here, and I'm going to erase this mess so we can see it a little better. I also have here a reference to the fact that you have here that Simeon is waiting for the consolation of Israel. I think that there is a balance here. And I'm going to just pull this down a little bit so you can see that Anna, I put Simeon in blue and there's Anna in blue. Those are the two figures. She is speaking concerning him to everyone who is waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. Now, I think those are two themes. Simeon, the consolation of Israel, the redemption here of Jerusalem. And there's a nice parallel there between Simeon and Anna. And I'm not going to get into that too much, but I do want you to see that that is a beautiful kind of frame here. Also, while I'm moving the board here, I put in purple here the law of Moses, the law of the Lord, the law of the Lord. Notice how Luke ends by, they completed all the things in the law of the Lord. Now that's a beautiful frame. So those are things that you just might want to observe about the beauty of this text. I think my time is coming sort of to an end here, so I want to get to what I think is really one of the main themes. And if I were to preach this text, this is where I would preach. And that is here in this section that has to do with the statement of Simeon to Mary, his mother, the mother of Jesus, about how this child, and I translate this as destined, is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and a sign to be spoken against. Now, here is where you will preach the cross, because I think here Simeon is warning Mary that this child is going to suffer. Now, this language of set for the fall and rising of many in Israel, if you go to Jesus' teaching in Jerusalem, I believe it's in Luke 20, he has a parable that the other Gospels have, and that's the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And then they send the son, of course, and they kill the son. And you see there, again, this statement here, the workers in the vineyard. You see this statement from Psalm 118, how the stone which the builders rejected, this has become the head of the corner. And some are going to stumble on that stone, and on some, people are going to be crushed by that stone. Now that statement of Psalm 118 and Jesus' interpretation of that in terms of the stone that is, in a sense, the stone that scandalizes, there you can see the stone which the builders rejected, the cross. This has become the head of the corner, the resurrection. This Jesus and his crucifixion is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel. In other words, there are going to be some that fall over it, that are going to trip over it, and there are going to be some that rise over it. And we just had a wonderful sermon this morning in chapel by Dr. Scare about the fact that Christmas is a time where you see that there are people who, receive Jesus in faith and those who reject him. And here is exactly that. There are going to be some who fall on him, reject him, and some that are going to receive him in faith. And this is the beginning, I think, of Luke's two categories. And you'll see this in the other gospel, but Luke is really, really, very clear on this, that those who reject are the religious establishment, particularly the Pharisees, and that those who receive him in faith are the sinners. And he is destined for that, and he will be a sign spoken against. Jesus is going to suffer. He is going to be spoken against, especially by the leaders. There, in Luke's gospel, the Pharisees are the ones who are most particular about moving towards his death in the trials. And then this statement, which I think has been interpreted in various ways to Mary here, and he says, you yourself, your soul will be pierced with a sword. Now, one way of understanding this, and I think this is sort of like the surface meaning of this, is that Mary herself is going to have deep sorrow when she sees the crucifixion of her son. And she's going to be deeply, deeply, broken by that. But I think there's another way of understanding this, and those of you who heard my podcast on the Annunciation for the fourth Sunday of Advent, I talked a little bit how Luke pictures Mary as the new Israel. And I think here Mary is more than just kind of the mother of Jesus. Mary here, as she will be in Revelation, the church, here she is Israel. And Israel is going to be pierced by the sword, and I think the sword here is the sword of God's word. She is going to be pierced by that sword. And that's why the hearts of many are going to be revealed. I mean, I always thought, how does Mary's own sorrow at the death of her son cause the hearts of many to be revealed? Well, I mean, I suppose you could extrapolate from that, but I do think that what you see here, Mary as the new Israel and the Word of God that Jesus preaches, that causes the fall and rising of many in Israel, that is a sign to be spoken against, that is going to reveal the hearts of many people. And what I would suggest for this preaching here is that you see this statement here as the way in which you can preach the cross here in this Christmas season. And as I think we've been accenting all along in our podcasts, that the season of Advent and Christmas and even Epiphany is the revelation that Jesus was born to die. And one of the other events that we celebrate in this very context here, in fact, I think it is really today, I think it's the 28th, that is the first Sunday of Christmas, is also the Holy Innocents. And isn't it interesting? I hope I'm right on that. I think I've got the dates right. Bill, am I right on that? I think so. Okay, the Holy Innocents is the other date that this day falls on, and you could probably preach on that. But with the Holy Innocents, where you have that horrific event, where you see the violence that comes when Jesus is born, here too you can preach on the cross of Christ within this magnificent statement of Simeon here in the Nunc Dimittis. So I just wanted to help suggest the preaching of Christ crucified here in this Christmas season and here in this incredible text from Luke chapter 2. And so once again, on behalf of the Exegetical Department of Concordia Theological Seminary, I want to thank you for your incredibly warm response to our podcasts. I'm so glad that some of my other colleagues are now doing this so that you can see the breadth and the depth of our faculty. And on behalf of our department, I want to continue to wish you a very Merry Christmas.